The bullet was still inside him when she told him, in Sicilian, exactly what she thought of men who wasted her operating room on a Tuesday night. The smell reached her first copper and antiseptic, and the particular cold that only came from someone who had been bleeding in the back of a car for too long. Then the sound. 2 sets of hard-soled shoes on the corridor tile, moving fast, and beneath that a third sound, slower, dragged. Sera Marino had been standing at the scrub sink for 11 seconds when the gurney came through the trauma bay doors, and she turned around and took inventory the way she had trained herself to do. Male, mid-30s, white dress shirt, with the left side gone dark, breathing shallow but present, pulse visible at the throat, alive. For now, behind the gurney came 2 men in black who did not look at the nurses and did not remove their hands from their jacket fronts. And the taller one held up a single finger at the attending resident who moved to intercept them. And the resident stopped. Sera did not stop. She moved to the gurney and pulled back the compress someone had pressed to the wound and looked at what was underneath and said, in English, "First, he's been shot. Get me O2. Get me Chen from anesthesia. Get me 4 units O negative, and someone needs to tell those 2 men in the doorway that if they are still standing there in 45 seconds, I will have them removed from this building." She looked at the taller man when she said the last part. He did not move. She looked back at her patient, and it was then, when she reached across to check the entry angle, and her hands found the wound track, and her mind ran the calculation of what had to be done in the next 3 hours, that the patient opened his eyes. He was looking at her with a focus that had no business existing in someone who had lost the amount of blood currently soaking through the sheet beneath him. Dark eyes. Very steady. The kind of attention that took years to learn, or was simply born into certain people who lived in rooms where inattention had consequences. He said something. She did not hear it over the noise of the bay. She leaned closer without thinking, and he said it again, quietly. And what he said was, "You have good hands." Sera Marino had not slept in 19 hours. She had come off a 7-hour thoracic repair at 4 in the afternoon, eaten half a sandwich at her desk, and answered 17 pages before this one. She was 34 years old, and she had been the only attending surgeon on overnight call every Tuesday for the past 8 months, because the hospital, he was short-staffed, and she had not yet learned to say no to the chief of surgery, and she was tired in a way that had moved past tired into something with no name. And this man, with 2 bodyguards at the door and a 9mm round sitting somewhere near his 4th rib, had just complimented her hands. She said it without meaning to. The words came out the way they always did when she was past the threshold of patience. In the language her grandmother had spoken in the kitchen every morning until Sera was 14 years old, and Donna Ursula had died quietly in her sleep in a house in Bay Ridge and taken the language with her. Or so Sera had believed. The phrase her grandmother used for men who made unnecessary problems was not one that translated cleanly into English. It was specific to a certain part of Palermo, a certain generation, a certain tone of exhausted female contempt that had been refined over centuries of dealing with men who thought their emergencies were more important than everyone else's time. Sera said it under her breath. Not at him. Not exactly. More at the situation, at the universe, at the particular combination of factors that had placed her here at 11:47 at night, with blood on her gloves and no sleep, and a patient whose security detail apparently outranked hospital policy. The man on the gurney went very still. Then, slowly, the left corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. Something more controlled than that. More private. A recognition. He looked at her with those steady dark eyes and he said, "In Sicilian," with an accent that placed him not in the general south of Italy, but specifically, unmistakably, in the streets around the Palermo market in Palermo. You learned that from someone who lived near the port, not from a phrase book. Sera's hands stopped moving for exactly 2 seconds, which was 1.5 seconds longer than she had ever stopped moving in an operating context. She stood, with her gloves on and her patient bleeding, and the noise of the trauma bay around her, and she stared at this man. Then she said, in English, flatly, "Or 2, now," and she walked. The surgery took 2 hours and 40 minutes. The round had clipped the lower lobe of the left lung and lodged against the 4th rib without fracturing it, which was the single piece of luck in the entire situation. Chen managed the anesthesia without asking questions, which Sera appreciated. And the scrub nurse she had worked with for 3 years handed her instruments with the same wordless efficiency that made Sera tolerate the overnight rotation better than she otherwise would. The 2 men in black stood outside the OR doors for the full duration. Nobody from administration appeared, which meant someone had made a phone call that Sera was not a party to. And she noted this and set it aside and focused on the work. She closed at 2:14 in the morning. She stood at the scrub sink and let the water run over her hands and looked at nothing and thought about the accent. It was not something you could fake. The particular vowel shift in the way he had said the word for port, the dropped consonant in the 2nd syllable, the rhythm that her grandmother had carried in every sentence like a physical trait, like the shape of her hands. You did not acquire that from language software or from a semester abroad. You acquired it from childhood, from a specific neighborhood, from specific people, and the phrase he had used in response, the construction he had chosen, was not standard Sicilian. It was the register her grandmother used when she was being precise. Sera turned off the water and dried her hands and did not let herself think about it any more that night. She went to check on him at 6 in the morning. After 2 hours of sleep on the couch in the on-call room and a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been brewed sometime before she was born, he was in the private room on the 8th floor, the one the hospital kept for patients who required additional security arrangements, which was a phrase that appeared in the administrative manual and which everyone on staff understood to mean a specific category of patient whose visitors did not sign in at the front desk. One of the men from the night before was sitting in a chair outside the door. He looked at Sera. She looked at him. She showed him her badge and he moved. The patient was awake. He was lying with the bed inclined at 30 degrees, the way she had ordered, with the drainage tube in place and the monitor showing numbers that were better than she had a right to expect. He was also reading something on his phone, which he set down when she came in, and he looked at her with the same quality of attention she had registered the night before. That particular focus that had not diminished with anesthesia and blood loss and whatever else had preceded his arrival in her trauma bay. Sera checked the drain output first, then the dressing, then the monitor readings, and she said the things she was required to say about pain management and mobility restriction and what he could expect in the next 48 hours. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Thank you," in English, with no accent at all. She picked up his chart to make her notation, and she said, without looking up, "You speak it without an accent." "Most of the time," he said. "Last night, you didn't." "Ah?" Pause. She looked up. He was watching her with something that might have been amusement or might have been calculation or was probably both. "Last night," he said, "you gave me a reason not to." Sera wrote her notation. She put the chart back. She looked at him directly, the way she looked at people when she needed them to understand something important about their own condition. And she said, "You have a drain in your chest, and a rib that came very close to a situation that would have required a significantly longer conversation. I would like you to rest and not make clever observations at 6 in the morning." She moved toward the door. "The woman who taught you that dialect," he said. "She used to say that same phrase, the same way, that particular rhythm at the end." He paused. It's very specific to one part of the city. Sera stopped walking. She did not turn around. Her hand was on the doorframe, and outside in the corridor, the monitor at the nurses' station was beeping steadily. And somewhere down the hall a cart was being wheeled across tile, and everything was normal, and she was standing very still, with her fingers against the painted metal of the doorframe. "Get some rest," she said, and she walked out. She did not let herself think about what he had just said until she was in the elevator alone. And then she let herself think about it for the 3 floors between the 8th and the 5th. And then the doors opened, and she stopped. She had work to do. She did not look up his name until the 2nd day. This was not because she had not thought about it. She had thought about it during rounds. During the follow-up consult, she sat through on a thoracic case that was not hers. During the 7 minutes she spent in the cafeteria not eating a salad at noon, the name would be in the chart. The name would tell her something. But names on a chart were her business only insofar as they affected the medical picture, and she had been very deliberate, for a very long time, about keeping the line between her business and everything else clean and well-maintained. So she did not look up his name until the 2nd day. And then she did it the way she did most things she did not want to admit to doing quickly. At the end of a note she was already writing, as if it were incidental. Vasquez. Nicolas. Age 36. No listed next of kin. Admitted via emergency intake. Attending surgeon. S. Marino. She read it twice. She closed the chart and went to see her next patient. He was sitting up when she came in on the 2nd morning, and he had shaved, which was not something she had expected, and he was wearing a dark grey shirt that someone had brought him, which meant he had possessions arriving and departing through this hospital without going through the front desk, which was something else to note and set aside. The drainage output was reduced overnight, which was good. His oxygen numbers were good. He was, by any clinical measure, doing better than a man with a recent gunshot wound to the chest had any right to expect at 40 hours post-op. And she told him so, in the specific neutral tone she used for delivering good news she did not entirely trust. "You had something to do with that," Nico said. "The surgical team had something to do with that." She made her notation. "How is the pain? Manageable. That is not a number on the scale I asked you to use." He considered this. "4," he said. "Sometimes 5. That is honest." She adjusted his medication order. She did not look at him while she did it, which was a habit she had developed, not with him specifically, but with a category of patient who looked at you in a way that expected something beyond the clinical. "Are you eating?" "I ate this morning." "What did you eat?" A pause. "Coffee." "That is not food." She made another notation. "Someone from dietary will come this afternoon. I would like you to eat something that requires chewing before I come back tomorrow morning." She moved toward the door. "You could stay," Nico said, not as a request, as an observation. Offered, without pressure, the way someone might note the weather. Sera stopped. She turned around. She held his chart in her right hand, and she stood in the doorway of a private room on the 8th floor of a Manhattan hospital. And she looked at him the way she had trained herself, to look at difficult situations straight at it, long enough to assess, not long enough to get pulled in. He was watching her with the same quality of attention she had registered twice already. That particular stillness. That was not passive. That was, in fact, the opposite of passive. The stillness of someone who had learned that paying attention was a form of power. He was not threatening. He was waiting. There was a difference, and she was aware that she was noting the difference, which itself was a thing she needed to stop doing. "I have 11 other patients," she said, and she left. What troubled her about Nico Vasquez was not who he was. She had treated patients from every corner of this city, patients whose affiliations she preferred not to examine closely. This was the work, and the work did not come with a screening process. What troubled her was what he had said. That specific phrase, that specific rhythm. The woman who taught you that dialect, he had said, and he had not finished the sentence. And she had been thinking about it for 32 hours, the way you thought about a door left slightly open in a room you had decided not to enter. Her grandmother had been a small woman with thick white hair, who grew basil on the windowsill of a house in Bay Ridge and came from Palermo in her 30s, and never spoke much about the years before she came. Sera had accepted this, the way children accepted the parts of their grandparents that existed before them. And then Donna Ursula had died, and Sera had built her life in the forward-facing direction. And this had worked for 20 years. She went back to work. On the morning of the third day, she found a different guard outside his door, younger, who checked her badge with slightly more visible attention than the first one had. Inside, Nico was standing at the window. He turned when she came in, moved back to the bed without being asked, which was something she noted in his favor. The exam was quiet. She was near the end of it, pressing carefully along the incision line to check for any signs of complication, when he said, "How long have you been at this hospital?" 8 years. You did your residency here, my fellowship. Residency at Columbia. She stepped back. The incision is clean. You are healing faster than the average, which I attribute to good baseline health and the fact that you are apparently too controlled to allow yourself to have a fever. Something moved in his expression, almost amusement. Is that a compliment? It is an observation. She put his chart down. You asked me yesterday how I learned the dialect. I didn't answer. You didn't, he said, not pressing, just confirming. I'm not going to answer today either. She picked up the chart. But I want to know what you were about to say. The second morning, you said, the woman who taught you that dialect, she used to say, and then you stopped. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with that particular attention, and she held his gaze, because she had not come this far in this profession by looking away from things that needed to be examined. Then he said, I was going to say that she used to say that same phrase when she was at the end of her patience with something, which was not often. She was a patient woman. He paused. I stopped because I was not certain you were ready to hear the rest of it. The room was very quiet. Somewhere down the hall a phone rang twice and stopped. Sera stood with the chart in her hand, and she said, carefully, the rest of what? He opened his mouth. Then his phone, on the bedside table, lit up and buzzed twice, and he looked at it, and whatever he saw there changed something in his face. He picked it up and said one word into it in Italian and listened for 10 seconds and put it down. He looked at her. I need to make a call, he said. Can we continue this tomorrow? She looked at him for a long moment. She said, yes. She left. She did not think about it. She worked until 7 in the evening, and she picked up dry cleaning she had forgotten about for 2 weeks, and she bought groceries for the first time since the previous Thursday, and she drove home to her apartment in a building on the west side of Manhattan that she had lived in for 6 years, and she parked in the basement garage and took the elevator up. The man was standing near the elevator bank when the doors opened. He was average height, wearing a coat that was too heavy for the season, and he looked at her with the kind of non-expression that people who had practiced it wore. Sera stepped out of the elevator and he said, Dr. Marino. Not a question. She stopped. She did not back up toward the elevator. She had learned, early in her career, working nights in a hospital where the parking structure was poorly lit, that backing up was the wrong instinct. She stood where she was and she said, yes, I understand you're treating a patient. The man said, a private matter. I was hoping you might tell me how he's progressing. Sera looked at him for 3 seconds. She had never seen this man before. He had not come through the hospital. He had come here. to her building, where he should not have known to find her. "I don't discuss patient information outside the hospital," she said. "If you have a medical inquiry, you can contact our patient services office." She walked past him toward the lobby door, and she did not run, which required more deliberate effort than she would have liked to admit. She reported it to building security that night. She called the hospital security office the next morning from her car before going in. She did not tell anyone else. She did not tell Nico Vasquez. Not yet. Because telling him felt like a decision she was not ready to make about what kind of situation she was in. She thought about it on the drive-in, and she thought about it between patients, and she thought about it standing at the scrub sink. And by the time she walked into his room on the fourth morning, she had decided to tell him. He was on the phone when she came in. He held up one finger, the same gesture the guard had made in the trauma bay 4 days ago, and she sat in the chair by the window and waited. And she looked at the way the morning light came through the glass and thought about a house in Bay Ridge with basil on the windowsill and a woman who had come from Palermo with her history folded away where no one could find it. When he ended the call, she said, "Someone came to my apartment building 2 nights ago. He asked about your condition." Nico went very still. It was a different stillness than the patient, watchful one she had come to recognize. This was the stillness of a person whose calculations had just changed. He sat up straighter, which made him wince, which he did not acknowledge. And he said, "Describe him." She did. Nico listened without moving. When she finished, he picked up his phone again. "I need to make 2 calls," he said. "And then I need to tell you some things." He looked at her directly. "If you are willing to stay." She had 11 other patients. She looked at him across the room. This man who had grinned in Sicilian while bleeding on her gurney. This man who had not finished a sentence that had kept her awake for 4 nights. This man whose stillness had just shifted in a way that told her more than anything he had said. "I'll stay," she said. He told her 3 things that morning, and did not tell her a 4th. The first thing he told her was that the man at her building worked for a woman named Caterina Monreale, and that Caterina Monreale had reasons to want to cause Nico difficulty, and that these reasons were old and complicated, and not something he was going to summarize in a hospital room in 10 minutes. The second thing he told her was that his people had already identified the man and that he would not be coming back to her building. The third thing he told her was that he was arranging for someone to be in the vicinity of her building for the next several weeks as a precaution, and that this person would not contact her or make themselves visible, and that she would not need to do anything differently. He did not tell her that Caterina Monreale had already identified Sera specifically, by name, by address, by her relationship to a woman who had died 20 years ago. This was the 4th thing. He set it aside in the way he set aside information that he needed to manage the release of carefully. And he looked at Sera Marino, sitting in the chair by his window with her hands in her lap and her face doing the thing it did when she was processing something she did not like. A particular stillness that reminded him, in a way he was not prepared to examine directly, of someone else. "I don't want someone stationed near my building," Sera said. "I know. I'm telling you I don't want it." "I heard you." He looked at her. "It's already arranged." The chair scraped back slightly as she shifted her weight. Not standing, just repositioning. A controlled expression of something she was not going to say out loud. She looked out the window for a moment. The view from the 8th floor was a section of midtown rooftops and a strip of sky that was doing something complicated with clouds. Then she looked back at him. "You said the reasons were old and complicated." "They are." "How old?" He considered how much to give her. Old enough that the original argument is almost beside the point. What remains is the feeling. And feelings like that one don't improve with time. He paused. "She lost someone. She holds my family responsible. Is she right to?" A long silence. He held her gaze. "Partly," he said. Sera looked at him for another moment, then picked up his chart from the bed and made a notation she had probably already planned before the conversation started. "Your discharge is in 2 days if your numbers hold," she said. "I'm going to recommend outpatient follow-up, and I'm going to strongly recommend that you do not engage in any activity that strains the incision for 6 weeks, which I understand is not how you typically operate, but I am going to say it anyway because it is my job." She put the chart down. "When you are no longer my patient, the conversation we've been not quite having will be easier to have." He watched her. "You mean about the dialect?" "I mean about everything." She left. He watched the door after she was gone, and he thought about Donna Orsola, a small woman with white hair and hands that smelled like basil, who had hidden a 12-year-old boy in her house for 11 days during the worst period of his family's history and asked nothing in return except that he eat his meals and sleep at regular hours and not track mud on her kitchen floor. He thought about the ring he had been carrying for 10 years, in a small cloth pouch in the inside pocket of whatever jacket he wore. He had not gone to find Sera Marino. He had been shot on a Tuesday night, and she had been the surgeon on call, and the universe had its own arrangements about timing. He picked up his phone and called the man he trusted most and said, "Move the timeline on Caterina. I want her contained before discharge." The man on the phone said it would be done. Nico put the phone down and looked at the ceiling and thought about what Sera would say when she found out what he had not yet told her, and whether she would understand why he had made the choices he had made, and whether understanding and forgiving were the same thing or had anything to do with each other at all. Sera got home at 8 that night and ate standing at the kitchen counter, the way she always did, when she was alone, and she thought about the conversation. Something had shifted. He had said the words old and complicated and partly, and the way he had said partly had told her more than any elaboration would have. He was not pretending to be clean. He was not asking her to pretend either. She washed her dish, and she looked at the cabinet above the refrigerator where she kept things she did not have frequent occasion to use. And after a moment, she got the step stool and reached up and took down the wooden box. It was small, the size of a shoebox, made from some kind of dark wood she had never identified, with a clasp that did not lock. Her grandmother had kept it in her bedroom, and Sera had inherited it without asking what was in it. She had looked inside once, the week after the funeral, and then closed it and put it in the cabinet above the refrigerator and left it there for 20 years. This was not avoidance, she had told herself at the time. This was appropriate respect for the privacy of the dead. She set it on the kitchen counter and opened the clasp. The inside smelled like cedar and something else. Something older, something that she could not name, but that her body recognized the way. Your body recognized a smell from childhood before your mind caught up. There was a rosary with dark wooden beads. There was a folded piece of paper with writing on it in Italian that Sera could read well enough to understand it was a list. Provisions or instructions of some kind, the handwriting very small and precise. There was a thin gold chain, and at the bottom, in a small envelope made from what looked like paper torn from a grocery bag, there was a photograph. She picked it up. She held it under the kitchen light. It was black and white, overexposed slightly, the way photographs from that era often were. It showed the front stoop of a brownstone that she recognized after a moment as the Bay Ridge house, the one her grandmother had lived in since before Sera was born. Standing on the stoop was her grandmother, younger, with her hair still half dark, smiling with the particular contained satisfaction that was as expressive as Donna Orsola ever got in photographs. And standing beside her, slightly in front, was a boy. He was perhaps 11 or 12 years old. He was thin, with dark hair that needed cutting, and he was looking not at the camera but at something to the left of the frame, with an expression of concentrated attention that was so specific, so particular, so completely recognizable to Sera after 8 days of morning rounds, that she put the photograph down on the counter and put her hand flat over it and stood there for a moment without moving. Then she picked up her phone and looked at the time. It was 9:43 in the evening. She put the phone down. She picked up the photograph again and looked at it until she was sure she was not wrong. And she was not wrong. She did not sleep well. She was at the hospital by 6:15, which was earlier than usual, and she went to the 8th floor first, before rounds, before coffee, and the guard outside the door was the original one, the taller one, who had been there since the first night, and he looked at her badge and let her through. Nico was awake. He was sitting up with the morning light behind him, and he looked at her when she came in, and something in his expression changed. A small shift. Some adjustment in the quality of his attention that told her he had already registered that something was different. She did not say good morning. She set the photograph on the bedside table and stepped back. He looked at it. He went very still. The particular stillness she now understood was not the absence of reaction, but the management of it. The way someone stood when something hit them in a place they had not adequately armored. He picked it up. He held it for a long moment, and she watched his face, and it did not tell her everything, but it told her enough. "When was this taken?" she said. "Not a question." "Exactly. I was 12. He said. "It was the summer of my 12th year." He set the photograph down on the table and looked at her. His voice was level. His hands were level. "She didn't tell you. She didn't tell me anything about that time." Sera stood with her arms at her sides, her weight evenly distributed, the way she stood in an operating room when the situation required steadiness rather than speed. "She didn't tell me she knew anyone like you. She knew me before I was anyone like me." He paused. "She hid me. For 11 days. There were people looking for my family during those 11 days. And she put me in the back bedroom and fed me, and told me to sleep regular hours. Pause. She was the most practical woman I have ever met." Sera looked at the photograph on the bedside table. Then she looked at him. Something in her chest was doing something she did not have clean clinical language for. A pressure that was not pain, exactly. Something that had more to do with 20 years of a closed cabinet above a refrigerator than with anything that had happened in the past 8 days. "She kept your photograph," she said. "In the box she kept in her bedroom." "She was like that," Nico said, quietly. "She kept things." The monitor beeped steadily, somewhere outside the window. The city was doing what the city did in the early morning. Its ordinary, enormous noise. Indifferent and constant. Sera stood in a hospital room on the 8th floor and felt the ground she had been standing on for 20 years shift very slightly beneath her. Not collapsing, just settling differently. The way ground did when something underneath it had changed. "Your discharge is tomorrow," she said. "Your numbers are good." Sera. It was the first time he had used her name. She picked up the photograph from the bedside table and put it in her coat pocket. "I'll come back this afternoon with the discharge instructions," she said. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame, in the same position she had stood in 8 days ago, when he had said something about the dialect that had kept her awake for 4 nights. She was a practical woman, she said, not quite agreeing, not quite conceding, just confirming that some things were true. She went out into the corridor. She walked to the elevator and rode it down alone and stood in the lobby for a moment before she went to find coffee. Her hand was in her coat pocket. Her fingers were around the photograph. She stood there until her hands were steady, and then she went to work. She was walking to her car at 7:43 in the evening when the woman stepped out of the shadow between 2 parked SUVs and said her name. Sera had been thinking about Nico's discharge paperwork, which she had finalized that afternoon, and which had required 3 separate conversations with the hospital administrator, who was trying very carefully not to ask questions about the security arrangements on the 8th floor. She had been thinking about this, and not about the parking structure, which was the mistake. The woman was not large. She was perhaps 40 years old, dark-haired, dressed in a coat that was too elegant for a parking structure, and she held nothing in her hands. She looked at Sera with the particular expression of someone who had been waiting for a specific moment and had arrived at it. "Dr. Marino," she said, "I'd like to talk." Sera stopped. She did not back up. She looked at the woman, and she looked at the two men she could now see at the edges of her peripheral vision, one near the stairwell door and one behind her to the right, and she made the calculation that most of the options available to her in this moment were not good ones. "All right," she said. The woman tilted her head slightly toward a black car idling near the far wall. "It will be more comfortable inside." It was not more comfortable inside. It was a car with the windows darkened and two men in the front seat who did not speak. And the woman sat across from Sera in the back and looked at her with those careful eyes and said, "My name is Caterina Monreale. I think Nico has mentioned me." "He mentioned the name," Sera said. "Then he told you I have a grievance." Caterina folded her hands in her lap. She was composed in the way of someone who had rehearsed this composure. "My brother's name was Matteo. He was 29 years old when the Vasquez family decided he was a threat to their interests. He was not a threat. He was inconvenient." She paused. "There is a difference." But the outcome was the same. Sera looked at her. "What do you want from me?" "I want Nico Vasquez to say it out loud." Caterina's voice was even. "Not to a lawyer. Not to an intermediary. To me. I want him to acknowledge what his family did. And I want it witnessed. And I want it on record, somewhere that cannot be erased." She looked at Sera directly. "You are leverage. That's the word for it. I'm not going to apologize for that." "You could have called him," Sera said. "He doesn't take my calls. You could have written a letter." "Dr. Marino." Caterina's voice did not change, but something behind it did. "I have been trying to have this conversation for 4 years. I am not here because I enjoy doing things this way. I am here because this is what remains after everything else has been closed to me." She looked out the darkened window for a moment. "I don't intend to hurt you. I want you to understand that. You've put 2 men in a parking structure. Yes. That constitutes a threat. It constitutes a demonstration that I am serious." Caterina looked back at her. "I am very serious." Sera sat in the back of the car and looked at the woman across from her and thought about what she knew about serious people, which was considerable, because the operating room was full of serious situations, and serious situations had a specific quality, a specific weight that you learned to recognize and work with rather than against. Caterina Monreale was not performing. Her hands were folded and her voice was level, and her eyes held something that was not rage and not grief, but the exhausted residue of both. The thing that remained after you had felt everything and still not gotten what you needed. Sera recognized it. She had seen it in family waiting rooms. She took out her phone. One of the men in the front moved. "I'm calling him," Sera said. "Not the police. Him." She looked at Caterina. "If you want him to hear it from you, then he needs to be here." Caterina was quiet for 4 seconds. Then she said, "All right." Nico picked up on the second ring. Sera said, "I'm in a parking structure on the west side of the building. I'm in a car with Caterina Monreale. She wants to talk to you." She paused. "I'm all right. Come alone or she won't talk." A silence on the line, brief and very dense. "I'll be there in 12 minutes, he said. He was there in 9. Sera heard him before she saw him. The particular sound of someone who moved with deliberate weight. And then the door opened. And he got into the back seat, and the temperature in the car changed in the way that temperatures changed when someone entered a room who was accustomed to being the most dangerous thing in it. He looked at Sera first. A single assessment, head to hands and back. Then he looked at Caterina. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "You look like him," Caterina said finally. "You look like your father." "I know," Nico said. "He never apologized either." "No," Nico said. "He didn't." Caterina's composure shifted. Not breaking, but moving, like ice that had found a crack. Matteo was not a threat to you. He was building something legitimate. He had a restaurant. He had a life. Her voice stayed level, but the levelness cost her something now. You could hear the cost. Your father decided he knew too much about the old arrangements. He was 29 years old. "I know what happened," Nico said. "Then say it." The car was very quiet. Sera sat to Nico's left, and she did not look away, and she did not intervene, because this was not her conversation to manage, and because she understood, with the same clarity she brought to the operating room, that the only way through certain things was straight through them, and not around. Nico looked at Caterina Monreale across the back seat of a car in a parking structure on the west side of Manhattan, and he said, "My father ordered Matteo Monreale killed in the spring of 1998 because he had information about a transaction that my father wanted buried. Matteo had not sold that information, and there was no evidence that he intended to. My father made a decision based on fear rather than fact, and it was wrong. Matteo Monreale was 29 years old, and he had done nothing to earn what happened to him." He paused. "My father is dead. I cannot undo what he did. But I can tell you that the decision was wrong, and I can tell you that I knew it was wrong before I knew the full facts, when I was old enough to know anything. And I did not say so publicly, and I should have. The silence afterward was different from the silence before." Caterina sat very still. Her folded hands tightened once and then released. Something in her face moved through several things without settling. And Sera watched it and did not name what she saw, because some things were not hers to name. "That's it," Caterina said. Her voice was smaller, not weaker, smaller. The way a thing got smaller when the pressure inside it had finally found a way out. "That's all I needed." "There's more," Nico said. "There's restitution. Concrete. Documented. Handled through a channel that your lawyer chooses. Not mine. Whatever Matteo's restaurant would have been worth. Whatever his life would have been worth. I understand those are not the same number, and I'm not going to pretend they are." He looked at her. "This doesn't fix it. I know that." "No," Caterina said. "It doesn't." She looked out the window for a moment. Then she looked back at him. "But it's something." She reached forward and opened the door herself. She stepped out without looking at either of them again, and the two men at the edges of the parking structure moved and followed her, and the sound of their footsteps diminished, and then there was nothing. Nico sat in the back of the car. Sera sat beside him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "You should have told me she had identified me," Sera said. "Yes. You decided I wasn't ready. I decided I could manage it before it became a problem." He looked at her. "I was wrong about the timeline. You were wrong about several things." "Yes." He did not qualify it or explain it. He said it the way he had said, partly in the hospital room, with the same particular quality of stillness, which she now understood was not control, but honesty. The two were not the same thing in him. "I'm sorry." Sera looked at the open door of the car. The parking structure was quiet. She looked at her hands for a moment, the hands that had taken a bullet out of this man's chest 18 days ago. Then she looked at him. "You've been carrying something of mine," she said. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. The cloth pouch was small, worn at the edges, the kind of worn that came from years of daily contact. He held it out to her. She took it. She opened it and shook the ring into her palm. It was gold. Simple, not decorative. She turned it over and looked at the inside of the band, and there it was, small and precise, the way her grandmother's handwriting had been small and precise. Serafina, her full name, the name no one had called her since she was a child. She sat with it in her palm for a long time. The city outside the parking structure made its ordinary noise. Nico sat beside her and said nothing, which was the right thing to do. "She told you about me," Sera said. "She told me everything about you. For 20 years. Whenever I saw her, she told me." He paused. She was very proud. Sera closed her hand around the ring. Something behind her sternum was doing something large and inconvenient that she was not going to examine in a parking structure. She breathed through it the way she breathed through difficult moments in surgery, steadily, one thing at a time. "Then," she said, "she left this with you 10 years ago. Yes, she knew you would find me. She said I would recognize you." Nico said. "She said when the moment came I would know." He looked at her. She was right, although I did not anticipate the specific circumstances. Despite everything, despite the hard wall of anger still sitting in her chest alongside everything else, something shifted in Sera's face. Not a smile. The precursor to one. The thing that happened in the muscles before the decision was made. She looked down at the ring in her closed hand. She looked at him. She always thought she knew best. She said, "She did know best," Nico said. "In my experience." Sera opened the car door. She got out. She stood in the parking structure with the ring in her hand and the night air coming in from the street, and she looked back at him through the open door. "You lied to me by omission," she said. "I need you to understand that I know that, and that it is not resolved. I understand. And the person near my building, I want them gone. Done." She looked at him for another moment. He looked back at her with those steady dark eyes, the same eyes that had focused on her across a gurney 18 days ago while he was bleeding. The same eyes that had gone very still when she put the photograph on his bedside table. She thought about a 12-year-old boy in the back bedroom of a house in Bay Ridge, eating at regular hours, not tracking mud on the kitchen floor. She thought about a small woman who kept things. "Good night, Nico," she said. She closed the door and walked to her car and drove home. She put the ring on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, next to where her grandmother would have kept the basil. 3 weeks passed, the way 3 weeks passed when you were a surgeon with 11 patients and a full schedule and a reason to keep yourself occupied. Fast during the day and slowly at night, when the apartment was quiet and the ring on the windowsill caught the light from the street in a way she had not anticipated and could not bring herself to move it. She had formally removed herself from Nico's case the morning after the parking structure, filing the conflict of interest paperwork with the kind of clean, efficient motion that she used for things she had decided and was not going to revisit. The outpatient follow-up had been assigned to another attending. She had no medical reason to contact him, and she did not contact him, and she told herself this was correct and professional, and she mostly believed it. Mostly being a qualifier she had not previously had occasion to use about her own convictions. She thought about the ring more than she thought about him. Or she told herself this, which was not the same thing. She thought about a woman who had come from Palermo in her 30s, with her history folded away, and her basil on the windowsill, and her small, precise handwriting, and a box of things she had kept. She thought about what it meant to keep things. She thought about the cabinet above the refrigerator and the 20 years she had chosen not to open what was inside it, and whether that was respect or something else. She was a person who looked at things directly. She had believed this about herself for a long time. The cabinet above the refrigerator complicated the belief. She was standing at the scrub sink at 6:40 in the morning, 3 weeks and 2 days after the parking structure, preparing for a thoracic repair that was scheduled to begin at 7. When she heard footsteps, she recognized, not because she had been listening for them, Because they were specific. That deliberate, particular weight. And she had apparently catalogued them without meaning to at some point during the previous weeks, which was information about herself she received without enthusiasm. She did not turn around. "You can't be up here," she said. "This is a sterile corridor." "I know." His voice came from the doorway. Not closer. He had stopped at the threshold. "I'm not coming in." She kept her hands under the water. The scrub was timed, and she was not going to rush it because he was standing in a doorway. "How did you get past the desk?" "I told them I was here to speak to my surgeon." "I'm not your surgeon anymore." "No," he said. "You're not." Pause. "That's why I'm here." She turned off the water. She dried her hands in the specific way she had been taught. Methodical. Corner to corner. She turned around. He was standing in the doorway in a dark coat, the color of which she noticed, and then noted that she noticed. And he looked the way he had looked at 36 hours post-op, when he had shaved and put on a clean shirt. Which was to say, he looked like someone who had assembled himself carefully for a specific occasion. He was thinner than he should be, which told her the recovery had not been entirely smooth, which was something she was not supposed to care about anymore. "You're not at full weight," she said. "The follow-up was 2 weeks ago. I was cleared. Cleared is a floor, not a ceiling." She looked at him. "You should be eating more." "I know," he said. "I've been told." He looked back at her with those steady dark eyes, and he did not say anything else for a moment. And she recognized the silence, because she had been in several of his silences now, and she had learned that they were not empty, that he was making a decision inside them. Then he said, "May I say something?" In Sicilian. She looked at him. The corridor was quiet, the particular early morning quiet of a hospital before the day's machinery fully engaged. And somewhere behind her, the OR was being prepped for 7 o'clock, and she had 11 minutes before she needed to be inside it. She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. He said it. It was not long. 6 words. Or 7, with a particular construction that she had not heard since she was a child. A specific formation that her grandmother had used for the specific occasion of acknowledging that you had caused harm that you could not repair and were asking not for forgiveness but for the chance to demonstrate that you understood the weight of what you had done. It was not a standard Sicilian phrase. It was a family phrase, a private one, the kind of thing that got passed through households and not through phrase books. It was Donna Ursula's construction, her specific rhythm. And hearing it in his voice from the doorway of a sterile corridor at 6:40 in the morning did something to the wall Sera had been building and maintaining for 3 weeks with the clean, efficient motion she used for things she had decided. She stood with her dried hands at her sides, and she breathed, steadily, the way she breathed through difficult things. She looked at him. "That's her phrase," she said. Her voice came out level. She was grateful for this. "She taught it to me," he said, "in the back bedroom, during the 11 days. She said I would need it one day, and that when I used it I should mean it and not use it otherwise." He paused. "I have not used it before." Sera looked at the floor for a moment. Then she looked at him. Something in her chest had been a particular shape for 3 weeks. A hard-edged shape with clean lines that she had constructed deliberately and maintained with care. And it was still there, but it had shifted slightly. The way something shifted when the load on it changed. Not gone. Different. She thought about a woman who was practical and kept things and thought she knew best and had, in Sera's experience, generally been right. She thought about a ring on a windowsill catching streetlight. She thought about a door she had been standing in front of for 20 years, and whether the choice to keep it closed was the same as the choice to open it, and whether either choice was actually hers to make, or had been made for her long ago by a small woman with white hair and better judgment than anyone in her immediate vicinity. She said, "I have a surgery at 7. "I know," he said. "I'll wait." She looked at him for another moment. "This corridor is sterile," she said. "You need to step back." He stepped back. He moved exactly one step back, into the hallway, which was technically no longer the sterile corridor, which was a distinction precise enough that she recognized the precision. She recognized it the way she had recognized the Palermo accent in the middle of a trauma bay, as something specific, as something that knew what it was doing. She turned back to the ore door. She stopped. She did not turn around. "The phrase she taught you," she said. "There's a response to it. Did she teach you the response?" A pause. "No," he said. "She said the response belonged to the other person." Sera put her hand on the OR door. She said, in Sicilian, in her grandmother's rhythm, in the construction that came after the one he had used, the one that meant not forgiveness, not yet, but the acknowledgement that the weight had been received and that she was still here and had not walked away 7 words, low, just for the corridor, just for the distance between them. She heard him go still. She pushed open the door and went in. The surgery took 2 hours and 50 minutes and was without complication. She closed at 9:47, which was 3 minutes ahead of her projected time. And she scrubbed out and dried her hands and stood at the window of the scrub room for a moment, looking at the morning light, doing its thing with the midtown rooftops, and felt, underneath the tiredness and the focus and the ordinary texture of her working day, something that she did not have clinical language for and did not try to name. Something that had to do with weight received and not walked away from. Something that had to do with a woman who kept things. She walked out of the scrub room and into the hallway, and he was there, leaning against the wall in his dark coat, thinner than he should be, looking at her with those steady, dark eyes that had been steady through anesthesia and blood loss and a parking structure and the particular pressure of her silence. He had waited. This was information. She received it. "There's a coffee cart on the 3rd floor," she said. "They make something that is technically coffee." She looked at him. "You look like you haven't been eating properly. Someone should supervise." Something moved in his face. Not the left corner of the mouth thing from the gurney. Something fuller than that. Something that had waited 3 weeks and 6 words in Sicilian before it was allowed to exist. "I would appreciate the supervision," he said. She walked toward the elevator. He fell into step beside her. They were in the hallway of a hospital on a Thursday morning in the city outside the windows. It was making its ordinary enormous noise, and somewhere on the windowsill of her kitchen, the ring was catching the light and the basil she had bought 2 weeks ago, and not yet planted, was still in its plastic pot on the counter, waiting. She pressed the button for the 3rd floor. The doors opened. They got in. She would have found this very satisfying, Sera said, looking at the numbers above the door. "Yes," Nico said. She would have been insufferable about it. The doors closed. She did not smile. But the thing that happened in the muscles before a smile decided to happen was happening, and she did not stop it. And the elevator descended. And outside the windows the city went on, being the city, enormous and indifferent and full of its own arrangements, which had nothing to do with 2 people standing in an elevator on a Thursday morning, and everything to do with it.